Iran is an ancient people with a history full of conquests, peaks, revolutions, and dramas. What many think is a desert country is actually one of mountains, provinces, fertile farming lands, and subtropical forests. We have to talk about the life and work of a religious cleric who in this nation took power and founded an Islamic republic after decades of what he and others perceived as moral, economic, and social decay in the context of the westernization of Iran. Controversial, relentless, and charismatic as a preacher and supreme leader of the revolution, Ruhollah Khomeini marked the contemporary history of the Middle East, that region so little studied and so simplified. For some, Khomeini was a regrettable display of religious fanaticism and intolerance. For others, he was a beacon of hope and resistance against Anglo-Saxon Western hegemony. Today we'll learn his fascinating story. This is Rinaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to follow me on my personal Telegram account, which you can find below this video. Please like this material, share it, leave your comments, and support us on our Patreon. Ruhollah Khomeini was born in September of 1902 into a small family in Tehran. He comes from a family that claims to be descendants of Muhammad and whose patriarchs were mullahs for many generations. By mullahs, we refer to clerical authorities well versed in the Quran. Ruhollah Khomeini grew up in this village during the turbulent years of World War I and the constitutional revolution in Iran, which for the first time put constitutional and parliamentary limitations on the Iranian monarchy. By 1918, his mother dies of cholera and leaves him orphaned while he was about to go to a seminary. There in that seminary, he stands out as a good student, and in later years he moves to Qom, where he puts on the black turban of the Sayyid and studies under Sheikh Abdul Karim Jairi. There he receives a conventional theological education, and in 1936 he becomes a Mostajet, that is, a scholar of Islam, and from that year he begins to write and preach. With a particularly extravagant interest in topics such as mysticism, which his other colleagues disapproved of and looked down upon, he decides to study books considered proscribed in academia, and he considers it important to explain religious ideas in terms that ordinary people could understand, and always under the veil of subversion to the prevailing authority. Iranians are one of the oldest civilizations in history. Since 500 BC, it was the seat of the powerful Persian Empire that shook the world more than once. More than a millennium later, the Iranian peoples were conquered by Islam, and almost another millennium later, in the year 1500 AD, the Persian Empire and monarchy were restored and established Shiite Islam as the only religion, being since then the only nation that has Shiite Muslim as the official religion. Iran would be ruled by successive monarchical dynasties until the protagonist of this video comes to power in the year 79. But going back to his early years as a scholar of Islam between the 30s and 40s, Khomeini always considered himself more prepared and gifted than everyone around him. Impeccably dressed, he always appeared to others as disconnected and reserved, even arrogant. But in his circle of students and friends, he was quite generous and eloquent. This public figure that he was cultivating as a teacher and religious leader was necessary to show authority and in the future a serene dignity. From the 20s, Iran was ruled by Emperor Reza Shah Pahlavi, also known as the Shah, with a government marked by a modernizing, secularist, and anti-clerical trend. Since then, the monarchy maintained a struggle with the Shiite Muslim clergy, who were highly respected by many Iranians. During World War II, Iran would suffer a direct invasion from Great Britain and the Soviet Union, very interested in Iran's vast oil reserves. That invasion forced the Shah, who was sympathetic to the Axis powers, to abdicate his throne and hand it over to his young son, who assumes a pro-British and pro-American government and is very friendly with Israel. And this new Shah intensifies a modernizing and westernizing process of Iran, not only economically but also socially and culturally, which in turn generates a nationalist response that opposed this. For his part, Khomeini, between the 1940s and 50s, would continue preaching in Qom, adopting anti-British and anti-colonial stances, combining intellectual strength, curiosity, and an unconventional preaching style that made him appear creative and innovative, although reticent towards his superiors in the theological caste. His talents also earned him the title of Ayatollah in 1961, following the death of another high-ranking cleric. What is monarchy? Since Iran became a constitutional monarchy, there was a prime minister with governmental duties in addition to the emperor. Great Britain and the United States also exerted great influence over this position, not only over the monarchy. Like in 1953, when the Iranian prime minister who tried to nationalize oil was deposed from power. All of this increases the disdain for the West in Iran, and Khomeini feeds off of it. By early 1963, the Shah launches the White Revolution. This revolution intensified the policies of westernization and the marginalizing policies of Islamism and traditionalists in government and public customs. Khomeini that year was nothing more than a cleric little known outside theological circles, but he began to preach forcefully and publicly against the Shah and his government for its corruption, land reform, and the situation of the poor classes and the defense of what he considered Iranian sovereignty in the face of attempts to westernize it. In the eyes of that cleric and his followers, the idea of cultural media and spaces that were denigrating to the Muslim tradition, the idea of importing consumerist habits from the West, the idea of women in public spaces wearing skirts and without a veil, the idea of an Iran subservient to the Zionist state of Israel, and the idea of an Iran that was handing over its hydrocarbons to the West were all ideas that already represented an unsustainable heresy. After continuing to gain ground with his sermons against the Shah, Khomeini was arrested in 1963 by the Shah's political police, the fearsome Zabak, and was released months later on the condition of remaining silent. But these events turned Khomeini into a figure important and prominent among the opponents of the Shah, much more well-known. Khomeini was in open opposition to Western constitutionalism, attacked American intervention in the country's internal affairs, and in his sermons addressed issues of national interest. Finally, Khomeini was deported and sent into exile in 1964 after a daring sermon against the United States and the Shah over a law that gave diplomatic immunity to American military personnel on Persian soil. Initially, he goes to Turkey, but he becomes uncomfortable for the Turkish government and they send him to Iraq, where his sermons also annoy the authorities. So he ends up on the outskirts of Paris by 1978. In those years, repression, rural unemployment as a result of agrarian reform, and the peasant exodus in Iran were a cause for alarm. The productive apparatus was paralyzed and the country's capital was overcrowded with more than 5 million inhabitants who were clustered in shanty towns without water and electricity. Despite the economic boom of oil in the 70s, industrial spending went towards complex industries and abandoned the countryside. Then, in 1973, with the events of the Yom Kippur War and the Shah's request to Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries to raise the prices of hydrocarbons, much more money enters a country where citizens saw little reflection of these revenues. The Shah is dedicated to buying weapons and holding luxurious events, while in the daily economy there was scarcity, unemployment, and crime. At the same time, Iran's trade relations with the United States and Israel were denounced, which in the opinion of many were unfavorable for the Persian nation. The 70s in Tehran was a strange place with a notable gap between the rich, middle class and poor, a dirty concrete metropolis crowded with people trying to sort out their lives in alleys tangentially lit with Coca-Cola neon signs, a secularized school and work system favoring Westerners, and a virtually non-existent health system favoring foreigners. The disdain for Westerners was increasing. In this same decade of the 70s, the Shah's police increased their repressive levels. But that revolution that Ayatollah Khomeini would lead would not have its followers in the marginal areas of Tehran, but in the young people from the rural and traditionally Muslim provinces of the rest of the country that, seeing how in their native provinces there was no work, nor the possibility of having a family because the women also went to study in the capital, displaying clothes and freedoms that in their opinion incited lust and greed. Tehran looked for many like the capital of frustration and deception. By 1977, the Shah, pressured by the Jimmy Carter administration, reduces repression, releases political prisoners, and has those tried in military courts transferred to civilian courts with lesser sentences. But the sentiment against him was already very strong. From France, the Ayatollah recorded his sermons on cassettes, which were then smuggled back to Iran and played clandestinely. In turn, Khomeini develops a political map for the establishment of an Islamic government, develops a doctrine, and his sermons become a book called Islamic Government, the Guardianship of the Jurist. And in that text, he proposes the need for a religious policeman necessary for the restitution of the dignity of the Iranian people, of governance in the hands of the Islamic jurist. He exposed the need for regents expert in the law of Allah, which expressed in the Sharia would be the only legitimate law by which to govern. In turn, this system would end the Shah's Western forms of government, reverse the agrarian reform, the agreements with the United States, and support for Israel. The religious hue of Khomeini's Shiite Islam gave cohesion and a sense of common purpose to many disparate elements, even those who were not religious at all. Despite the fact that there was little enthusiasm in Iran for these types of radically religious initiatives, Khomeini's ideas gained support among young people from various backgrounds who were commonly seeking to break away from the Shah's monarchy. In January of 1978, opposition press articles multiply, protests intensify, and as the months go by, the Shah bans public demonstrations, first in Tehran and then in the rest of the country. Meanwhile, from the outskirts of France, the Ayatollah had managed to accumulate a large amount of support both inside and outside of Iran, when many student groups of heterogeneous extraction, leftists, Marxists, Islamists, conservatives, among others, see in Khomeini the conjunction of discontent against the monarchy. The Shah promises elections, offers concessions to the opposition, but it was too late. As autumn turned to winter, the general strikes commenced, and from Washington, D.C., Carter decides that the Shah is becoming inconvenient. The Shah leaves Iran for a supposed operation, and in France, Khomeini boards an Air France plane from Paris to Tehran without knowing if the plane would be allowed to land. Accompanied by journalists and followers, he arrives in Tehran on the first day of February 1979, greeted by a mass of revolutionaries. As soon as he arrives in Iran, Khomeini establishes and leads a revolutionary council. He maintains contact with non-religious revolutionary elements and begins inexorably to remove all rivals who would stand in his way. In his vision of what the future of Iran would be, Khomeini manages to neutralize the provisional government that had formed in his absence and puts his allies to draft the commercial basis of a referendum that ended with 97% in favor of the proposal to create an Islamic republic, thus establishing a new constitution where there would be an elected president every 4 years, and Ruhollah Khomeini was instituted as the supreme leader of Iran. By May of 1979, Khomeini creates the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, also known as the Guardians of the Revolution, creating a military force that would counterbalance the army by training and arming followers and gang members. In this first phase of government, Islamic courts were also created that judge, condemn, and carry out summary executions of members of the old regime. These executions surprised moderates and liberals, both in Iran and around the world. And also, at that time, Khomeini creates the Islamic Republic Party. By the fall of 1979, not only the forces that had supported were completely marginalized, the old Shah regime, but also the forces that opposed the Shah but were of a secularist, liberal, and moderate nature. Under Khomeini's vision of governance in the hands of the Islamic jurist, secular laws begin to be supplanted by Islamic laws, and the new constitution puts Khomeini and his clerics in a supreme position with absolute power. During Khomeini's rule, marriage and birth rates are promoted, doubling the Iranian population from 36 million to 80 million people in a matter of decades. Likewise, Sharia, the Islamic law, is reintroduced, and education was Islamized at all levels, just like the cultural industry. Among other things, music that was not martial, Iranian, or religious was banned, and content that denigrated Islam would also be severely punished. Alcoholic beverages were banned, religious dress codes were also imposed, women had to cover their hair, and men could not wear shorts. In turn, opposition media outlets were shut down, and an anti-Western movement began to reclaim Iranian traditions. During Khomeini's regime, women's education rates also substantially increased in the case of university education above many Western countries. Islam is used to repress feminists, dissident theologians, liberals, and leftists. But there were two events that would permanently mark Khomeini's government. The first of these occurred during his first and second year in office. At the same time as these new reforms were being promoted, it triggered the famous hostage crisis in Iran. The 1979 crisis at the United States Embassy. The Shah had fled to the United States to treat a cancer that would end his life in July of 1980. This generated a protest in Iran demanding that the Shah be sent to Iran to be judged in that country. A group of Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy and took 52 members of the diplomatic staff hostage for 444 days, a crisis that generated a fiasco in United States domestic policy and cemented the failure of Jimmy Carter's presidency. In Iran, the takeover of the United States Embassy, a country they called the Great Satan, was quite popular and served to unify the new government. Khomeini cautiously backed the move and capitalized on the political climate to gain more power. Although the Shah died months after the kidnapping began, the crisis extended for a while longer, while Khomeini's supporters used the embassy as an intelligence center. However, this kidnapping of American personnel would not stay like this. A second storm was about to burst that would be much more consequential for the new Islamic government. Shortly after taking power, Khomeini starts calling for all Muslims to rise up in revolutions around the world. And at the same time, Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of the only Muslim country besides Iran that had a Shiite majority and that was also bordering Iran, sees these calls for Shiite Muslim revolutions as very inconvenient for Iraq. Additionally, Saddam Hussein, let's remember, was Sunni. At the same time, Hussein seeks to take advantage of what he assumed was Iran's weak military position, so in 1980, he decides to launch a large-scale invasion into Iran, especially to occupy the hydrocarbon-rich province of Khuzestan. He carries out this invasion with the endorsement and incentive of the United States and other Middle Eastern countries that saw in Khomeini and Islamism a government contrary to their interests. After Hussein's military occupation, Khomeini decides not to let Iraq's aggression go unanswered, urges the Iranian people to resist the invasion, and declares that the Islamic Republic will never surrender. The Iran-Iraq War was a brutal 8-year conflict that lasted from 80 to 1988. Both sides suffered massive casualties, and the conflict deeply affected both countries. There was little that Khomeini could do with the Iranian economy. With oil production severely affected by the war, the economic conditions of the population during Khomeini's rule only worsened. While Iran ultimately repelled the Iraqi invasion and prevented Iraq from achieving its objectives, the war inflicted a high price on the country, both in terms of human lives and material resources. Khomeini's decision to continue the war, despite the enormous costs it entailed, was based on his belief that it was a holy war against a secular and authoritarian neighbor aligned with the West. The war also helped to solidify Khomeini's government and reinforced his position as a leader of the Islamic Republic. Khomeini's call to arms and the fierce resistance to the Iraqi invasion galvanized the Iranian people and helped to consolidate his reputation as a leader willing to stand up to foreign aggression. The war also allowed Iran to develop new technologies and military strategies that contributed to the country's military strength and deterrence against aggression from other countries in the region. Ayatollah Khomeini has also played a key role since then in the creation and funding of Hezbollah, a Lebanese Shiite organization with an armed wing and a political wing. Khomeini provided them with an ideological foundation in addition to the millions of dollars annually. moral to Hezbollah and publicly praised them as key partners in the fight against Israel and the West. The government of Ayatollah Khomeini also had a significant impact on several Western hegemonic powers. An example of this is the United States, which saw its strategic interests in the Middle East challenged by Khomeini's uncompromising anti-American stance and his rhetoric against Israel and Zionism. Khomeini's call for an Islamic republic in Iran based on the principles of religious authority and social justice was seen by many as a rejection of Western liberalism and capitalism. The United States' response to the revolution, including the infamous hostage crisis, only served to deepen the mistrust between the two nations. Another example is Saudi Arabia, which saw Iran under Khomeini's leadership as a direct threat to its own efforts to export conservative Sunni Islam and maintain regional dominance. As such, Saudi Arabia has openly opposed Iranian influence in the region and often taken steps to counter Iran's political and military activities, such as supporting Sunni militant groups in Syria and Yemen. Ayatollah Khomeini's legacy has also impacted Israel, which sees Iran as a major sponsor of anti-Israel armed groups and a potential military threat. Iran's support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, as well as its rhetorical hostility against Israel, has exacerbated tensions between the two nations and contributed to a sense of perpetual conflict in the region. But in the mid-80s, Khomeini's health began to decline after spending 11 days in the hospital suffering from 5 heart attacks in just 10 days at the age of 89. On June 3, 1989, the leader of the Iranian Revolution died, who would be bid farewell by millions of Iranians at his funeral. The charismatic Shiite cleric who led the Islamic Revolution of '79 and overthrew the monarchy of Iran had a profound impact on the country's history and its place in the world. After his death, the cleric Ali Khamenei succeeded him as Supreme Leader of Iran, a position he still holds today in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Although Khomeini's government was marked by controversy and repression, his popular sovereign discourse and his uncompromising stance against the United States and its allies resonated with many in the Muslim world. His legacy lives on not only in Iran, where the ruling clerics still invoke his name, but also in other countries where his ideas continue to inspire religious and political movements. For some, he remains a beacon of hope and resistance against Anglo-Saxon hegemony. For others, he is a reminder of the dangers of religious fundamentalism and intolerance. Whatever the personal judgment, he was undoubtedly a prominent figure in modern Islamic history, whose influence will be felt in generations to come. Rinaldo Carrillo spoke to you. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to follow us on our Instagram account that you can find below and support us on our Patreon so that we can continue to bring you exclusive and quality materials.